The chamber on Vareth Prime was enormous, and it was designed to make certain species feel small, and Alara Vasquez had felt small in it for a very long time. She sat in the human seat, which was positioned near the back of the hall between a fungal collective that communicated through spore bursts and a silicon-based species that had not spoken in 11 years. And the seat itself was uncomfortable because it had been built for a species with 4 legs, and nobody had ever bothered to replace it despite 42 years of formal requests. 42 years since humanity had joined the Galactic Accord, and in all that time, not a single meaningful thing had changed for her species. The council session droned on, and the Velthari High Speaker stood at the central podium, wrapped in robes of living light that shifted color with every word, and he spoke about trade regulations and defense allocations, and the redistribution of mining rights in the Kesari Belt. And Alara listened to every word, because that was her job, even though none of it would ever benefit Earth. Humanity held what the council called a provisional seat, and that designation was supposed to last 5 years, and it was supposed to be a transitional period, while new species learned the rules and customs of galactic civilization, and then they were supposed to receive full membership with full voting rights and full protections. 5 years had become 10, and 10 had become 20, and 20 had become 42, and every single time Alara or her predecessors had raised the issue, they were told the same thing, which was that the review was ongoing, and that patience was a virtue respected by all civilized species. She had memorized the exact number of times humanity had formally petitioned for full membership, and that number was 117, and she had memorized the number of times the petition had reached an actual vote, and that number was 0. Today the session turned to a new motion, and the Velthari delegate, whose name was Torvax, and who had held his seat for over 300 years, because his species lived for a very long time, stood and presented a proposal to restrict human expansion in the Orion Shelf. The Orion Shelf was a stretch of dead space that no other species wanted because the stars were dim, and the planets were barren, and the resources were thin, and humanity had been slowly and quietly settling it for 2 decades because nobody else cared, and it was the only place they were allowed to go. Torvax spoke with the kind of calm authority that came from centuries of never being questioned, and he explained that recent ecological assessments had revealed that human settlement patterns posed a risk to undiscovered microbial life in the region, and that it would be prudent to halt all expansion until a full review could be completed. Alara knew the ecological assessments were fabricated because she had read them, and they cited studies that did not exist and referenced research stations that had never been built. And she knew this because humanity had mapped every rock and dust cloud in the Orion Shelf, and there was nothing alive there except the humans who had made it their home. She wanted to stand and say this, but she had learned long ago that standing and saying things in this chamber accomplished nothing, because the votes were decided before the sessions began, and the elder races had already made their agreements in private rooms that humans were never invited to enter. The vote was called, and the numbers appeared on the great display above the podium, and they read 207 in favor and 14 against, and 91 abstentions, and the motion passed, and Alara watched the numbers glow, and she felt something shift inside her chest, and it was not anger because she had burned through anger years ago, and it was not sadness because sadness required hope, and she had very little of that left. It was clarity. She stood, and the chamber barely noticed, because the human delegate standing was about as noteworthy as a chair creaking, and she walked to the speaking platform, and she activated her translation matrix, and she spoke. Her voice was calm, and she did not raise it, and she did not let it tremble, and she said that humanity had noted this decision, and that humanity would remember it. That was all she said. The chamber was quiet for about 2 seconds, and then Torvax made a sound that his species used for amusement, and he said something about mammalian dramatics, and the translation systems carried his words to every seat, and laughter spread across the hall in waves, and it came from dozens of species and hundreds of delegates, and it filled the enormous chamber, and Alara stood in the middle of it and let it wash over her. She did not flinch, and she did not look away, and she waited until the laughter faded, and then she returned to her seat and she sat down. The session continued as if nothing had happened. When it ended 3 hours later, Alara walked through the corridors of Vereth Prime, and she passed delegates from 100 different worlds, and not one of them looked at her, and not one of them acknowledged her presence, and she moved through them like a ghost, and she thought about how fitting that was. The human embassy was a small building on the outer ring of the diplomatic quarter, and it was modest and clean, and it had a garden that the staff maintained because humans needed green things around them to feel sane. And Alara walked through the garden, and she touched the leaves of a plant that had been brought from Earth, and she felt the texture of it between her fingers, and she allowed herself one moment of stillness. Then she went inside and she walked past her staff, who looked at her with questions in their eyes because they had watched the session on their screens, and they had seen the vote, and they had seen the laughter, and they wanted to know what came next. She did not answer their unspoken questions, and instead she went to her private office, and she sealed the door, and she activated the quantum encrypted channel that connected directly to Earth, and specifically to a building buried deep beneath the mountains of Switzerland, where the United Defense Directorate conducted its most classified operations. The channel opened, and a voice on the other end said her name, and she recognized it as belonging to Admiral Kofi Asant, who was the head of the Directorate, and who had been waiting for this call for a very long time. Alara sat in the silence for a moment, and she thought about 42 years of patience, and 117 ignored petitions, and she thought about the laughter that still echoed in her memory, and she thought about every human who had ever sat in that uncomfortable chair and smiled politely while being treated as less than nothing. And then she said 2 words. "Begin, Prometheus." The channel closed, and Alara sat alone in her office, and she looked at the wall where a photograph hung, and it showed Earth from space, and it was small and blue and impossibly beautiful against the black, and she had put it there on her first day as ambassador 12 years ago to remind herself what she was fighting for. On the other end of the channel, deep beneath the Swiss mountains, Admiral Asant set down his communicator, and he looked at the team assembled around him, and they were men and women who had spent their entire careers preparing for a moment they hoped would never come, and he told them that the order had been given. Nobody cheered and nobody celebrated, and the room was filled with a heavy and serious silence, because every person in it understood what Prometheus meant and what it would set in motion and what it would cost. But they also understood what 42 years of humiliation had cost, and they understood that there comes a point where patience stops being a virtue and becomes a wound that never heals. And so they began. Across human space, in shipyards hidden in the dark places between stars, machines that had been sleeping for years started to wake up, and the sound of their awakening was the quietest thing in the galaxy and also the most dangerous. The Council on Vereth Prime continued its business the next day and the day after that, and the delegates laughed and argued and made deals, and none of them noticed that anything had changed because nothing visible had changed. But beneath the surface of everything, like a current running deep under still water, something enormous was moving, and it was patient, and it was precise, and it had been waiting for a very long time. And now it was awake. The galaxy believed it understood humanity, and that was the greatest mistake any species had ever made. The Council's files on Earth were thorough in the way that a child's drawing of the ocean is thorough, and they captured the surface and missed everything beneath it, and the species that compiled those files never suspected for a moment that what they were looking at was a perform. Ants. When humanity made first contact 42 years ago, the delegation that met the Velthari scouts was careful, and the ships they arrived in were competent but unspectacular, and the weapons they displayed were functional but unremarkable, and the technology they demonstrated was exactly advanced enough to earn a seat at the table, and not one fraction more. This was not an accident. Humanity had learned from its own history that the strong devour the weak, and that the only thing more dangerous than being weak is being strong and letting everyone know it. And so, on that first day, when human engineers shook hands with alien diplomats, they smiled and showed them the ships they were allowed to see, and they said nothing about the ones they were not. For 42 years, the galaxy looked at humanity and saw a young species still finding its feet, and they saw a civilization that was clever but limited and ambitious, but contained, and they filed their reports and updated their databases and congratulated themselves on their thorough understanding of the mammals from the third planet. They never once considered the possibility that they were being lied to. Admiral Kofi Asant stood on the bridge of a ship that did not officially exist, and he looked out through the viewport at a fleet that the galaxy did not know about, and he felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. The ship was called the HSS Consequence, and it was the first of its kind, and it was built in a shipyard carved into the core of a rogue planet drifting in the black space between spiral arms, and no sensor in the known galaxy could detect it because it emitted nothing and reflected nothing, and as far as the universe was concerned, it was not there. The Consequence was a fracture-class dreadnought, and it moved through space in a way that no other ship in the galaxy could because its drive system did not work like anything the Council had ever imagined. Every species in the Accord used slipspace corridors to travel faster than light, and these corridors were stable and predictable, and they connected fixed points like roads connecting cities, and they were also extremely easy to monitor, which meant that every ship that used them could be tracked. Human engineers had looked at slipspace corridors and understood them completely, and then they had done something that no other species had thought to do, which was to ask what would happen if instead of traveling through space, you broke space itself. The answer was the fracture drive, and it worked by shattering local spacetime into fragments and riding one of those fragments to the destination, and then letting reality heal behind the ship like water closing over a stone, and it left no trail and no signature and no trace, and a ship using a fracture drive could appear anywhere at any time without warning. Asant walked the corridors of the Consequence, and he passed crew members who nodded at him with respect and quiet focus, and he thought about the 18 months since Alara had given the order, and he thought about everything that had been set in motion since that night. The shipyards had accelerated production, and across 27 hidden facilities spread through the darkest and most empty regions of space, construction crews worked around the clock building more fracture-class vessels, and by now the fleet numbered over 10,000, and each one was invisible, and each one was deadly, and each one was crewed by men and women who understood exactly what they were preparing for. But the ships were only part of it. The real revolution was the Ember Network, which was the system that connected every human vessel into a single coordinated intelligence. And it was not a central command structure, because central command structures had a weakness, which was that you could destroy the center and everything would fall apart. The Ember Network had no center, and every ship in the fleet was both a soldier and a general, and the network processed information across thousands of nodes simultaneously, and it could coordinate an entire battle fleet with the precision of a single mind. And it could do this even if half the fleet was destroyed, because every remaining ship carried the full capability of the whole. Asant had watched simulations of the Ember Network in action, and it was like watching a flock of birds move as one body, and each bird was independent, and yet the whole flock turned and dove and climbed in perfect unison, and it was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. And then there was the Ghost Doctrine, which was the name for humanity's approach to detection, and the approach was simple in concept and staggering in execution, and it meant that every human ship was invisible to every known sensor type in the Accord's arsenal. The Council species used electromagnetic detection and gravitational scanning and quantum field resonance mapping and tachyon pulse tracking, and humanity had studied every single one of these methods and had developed countermeasures for all of them, and a human ship running under Ghost Doctrine was as detectable as a thought. Asant reached the observation deck, and he stood there alone, and he looked at the stars, and he thought about his grandmother, who had told him stories when he was a child about how their ancestors had survived terrible things by being patient and by being smart, and by never letting their enemies see their true strength until the moment it mattered. She had not been talking about galactic politics, but the lesson was the same. In another part of human space, the intelligence operations were proceeding with the same quiet precision, and agents, who had been embedded in council bureaucracies for decades, were now doing something that looked completely innocent, which was going home. Human scientists stationed at Accord research facilities requested transfers back to Earth citing family reasons, and human diplomats on council worlds completed their postings and departed, and human families living on alien stations packed their belongings and booked passage on commercial transports, and none of these movements were sudden or dramatic or suspicious, because each one had a perfectly reasonable explanation. But taken together across hundreds of worlds and thousands of individuals, the pattern was unmistakable if you knew what to look for, and nobody did. On Vareth Prime, the council continued its sessions, and Alara Vasquez attended everyone, and she voted on every motion even though her vote had never once changed an outcome, and she sat in her uncomfortable chair, and she listened, and she smiled. The Velthari introduced a new motion during this period, and it was a proposal to levy what they called a developmental species surcharge on civilizations that had not yet achieved full membership. And since humanity was the only species still classified as provisional, the surcharge was aimed directly at Earth, and everyone in the chamber knew this and nobody pretended otherwise. The motion passed with an even larger margin than the last one, and this time nobody even bothered to record humanity's vote against it. Alara did not stand, and she did not speak, and she did not protest, and instead she simply smiled, and it was a calm and genuine smile, and Torvax, the Velthari delegate, noticed it from across the chamber, and something about it made his skin prickle in a way he could not explain. He mentioned it later to a colleague, and he said that the human had smiled as though she knew something he did not, and his colleague, who was a member of the Rithani collective, and who was known for analytical precision, said that this was almost certainly Torvax imagining things, because what could a provisional species possibly know that an elder race did not? Torvax accepted this explanation, but the memory of that smile stayed with him like a splinter buried just beneath the skin. Back on the Consequence, Admiral Asant received his daily briefing, and the fleet was at 80% readiness, and the Ember network had completed its final integration tests, and the Ghost Doctrine protocols were functioning at full capacity, and the intelligence withdrawal was proceeding on schedule. His executive officer, a woman named Commander Rhea Chen, stood beside him, and she looked at the numbers, and she said that they would be ready within 6 months. Asant nodded, and he felt no excitement and no eagerness, and he felt only the grim and heavy understanding that what they were about to do would change the galaxy forever, and that there would be no going back. He thought about Alara sitting in that chamber surrounded by species that laughed at her and dismissed her and treated her like she was nothing, and he thought about every human child on every colony world who had grown up knowing that their species was considered lesser, and he thought about the quiet dignity with which humanity had endured 4 decades of contempt. And he made himself a promise that, when the time came, the galaxy would learn that humanity's silence had never been weakness. It had been preparation. In the hidden shipyards, the last of the Fracture-class vessels powered up its drives for the first time, and the ship hummed with energy that bent the fabric of space around it, and the crew stood at their stations, and they felt the vibration in their bones, and they knew that they were standing inside a weapon that could reshape the balance of power across 1,000 star systems. And still the galaxy suspected nothing. And still humanity smiled and nodded, and paid its surcharges, and attended its sessions, and voted its meaningless votes, and endured its quiet humiliations. And still beneath the surface, the current grew stronger and faster, and more dangerous with every passing day. The Velthari had a saying that was old and respected among their kind, and it went like this, and it said that the creature that makes the most noise in the forest is never the predator. They had forgotten their own wisdom, and they were about to be reminded. It happened on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar, though no other species in the galaxy cared about Earth's calendar, and it happened all at once, and it was the kind of event that divided history into before and after. One moment humanity was there, and the next moment it was not. Every human ship in the galaxy vanished from every sensor simultaneously, and every human colony went dark, and every human station stopped transmitting, and every communication channel that connected human space to the rest of the Accord fell silent, and the silence was so sudden and so total that, for the first few hours, most species assumed it was a technical malfunction. The Galactic Council was called into emergency session, and the great chamber on Vareth Prime was filled with delegates who were confused and irritated, and some of them were frightened, though they would not admit this. And the Velthari High Speaker stood at the podium and declared that there was no cause for alarm, and that the humans were almost certainly experiencing some kind of internal systems failure. This explanation satisfied nobody, but it was the only one available. The Rithani Collective, which was a hive species known for its mathematical precision and its inability to tolerate uncertainty, sent a delegation of analysts to the sensor arrays, and they ran every diagnostic they could think of, and then they ran diagnostics on the diagnostics, and then they stood in silence for a very long time. The lead analyst, whose designation was 7 of Resonance, addressed the council with a tremor in its harmonic voice that its species almost never displayed, and it said that the sensors were functioning perfectly, and that there was no malfunction, and that the humans had not disappeared from the sensors, because the sensors had failed. The humans had disappeared from the sensors, because the humans could not be detected. The chamber erupted into noise, and 100 species talked over each other, and the sound was overwhelming, because some of them communicated through vibration, and some through light pulses, and some through chemical emissions, and the air in the chamber became thick with competing signals. Torvax, the Velthari delegate, demanded order, and he insisted that this was impossible, because no species could hide an entire civilization from Accord sensor technology. And the Rithani analyst looked at him with all 7 of its optical clusters, and said that the word impossible was a statement about the observer's limitations, not about reality. Torvax did not appreciate this response. Over the next several days, the full scope of the vanishing became clear, and it was staggering, and the numbers were almost too large to process. And the Council's intelligence services compiled a report that was distributed to all delegates, and the report said that approximately 19 billion humans had disappeared, along with every ship and every station, and every orbital platform and every ground installation, and every satellite and every probe, and every single piece of technology that humanity had ever built. 19 billion people gone without a trace, and without a sound, and without a single alarm being triggered. The galaxy had never seen anything like it, and the galaxy did not know how to respond. Some species reacted with fear, and they pulled their fleets back to their home systems, and they activated defense protocols, and they watched their borders with nervous attention, and they waited for something terrible to happen. Other species reacted with curiosity, and they sent scout ships to the edges of what had been human territory, and the scout ships found nothing, and they probed deeper, and they still found nothing, and the space where humanity had lived was empty and dark and silent. The Velthari reacted with anger because anger was easier than fear, and they declared that humanity had violated the accord by withdrawing without authorization, and they proposed sanctions and trade embargoes against a species that was no longer there to receive them. And the absurdity of this was lost on no one except the Velthari themselves. But the most unsettling consequence of the vanishing was not military, and it was not political, and it was economic. Humanity had been classified as a provisional species for 42 years, and during that time, it had been treated as minor and unimportant, and the Council had never bothered to examine just how deeply human work had become embedded in the systems that kept galactic civilization running. It turned out that the answer was very deeply indeed. The first crisis hit the medical sector, and 17 Accord species relied on pharmaceutical compounds that had been developed or refined by human biotech firms. And when those firms vanished, the supply chains broke, and within 3 weeks hospitals on 40 worlds reported critical shortages of essential medicines. The second crisis hit the food supply, and not because humans had been feeding the galaxy, but because humans had designed the logistical systems that kept food moving efficiently across interstellar distances. And these systems were elegantly complex, and they had been built by human engineers who understood optimization in ways that other species admired but never bothered to learn. And without those engineers, the systems began to degrade, and shipments were delayed, and perishable goods spoiled. Transit and worlds that had always had enough suddenly did not. The third crisis hit the computational infrastructure, and human programmers had written the code that ran the translation matrices used in every council session, and they had built the algorithms that managed slip-space corridor traffic, and they had designed the encryption protocols that secured Accord communications, and all of these systems continued to function for now. But without maintenance, they would eventually fail, and there was nobody left who understood them well enough to fix them. The galaxy was discovering in the most painful way possible that the species it had dismissed as minor and provisional had been holding everything together. On Verath Prime, the Council was in continuous emergency session, and delegates argued and blamed each other, and proposed solutions that solved nothing, and through all of this one seat remained empty. And that was the human seat, which was still uncomfortable and still built for a species with 4 legs, and nobody sat in it, and nobody looked at it, but everyone was aware of it. And then on the 14th day after the vanishing, Alara Vasquez walked into the chamber. She was the last human on Verath Prime, and she had remained behind while every other human had departed, and she had spent the past 2 weeks in the embassy alone, and she had watched the chaos unfold on her screens, and she had waited for the right moment. The chamber fell silent when she entered, and every delegate turned to look at her, and for the first time in 42 years, every single eye and optical cluster and sensory organ in that enormous hall was focused on the human representative. Alara walked to the central podium, and she moved slowly and deliberately, and her footsteps echoed in the silence, and she placed a small crystal on the surface of the podium, and the crystal was a standard data storage device, and it contained a single file. She activated the file, and it projected into the air above the podium for every delegate to see, and it was a document, and it was very long and very detailed, and it contained a record of every interaction between humanity and the Council for the past 42 years. Every petition that had been buried was listed with its date, and its contents, and the names of the delegates who had blocked it, and every vote that had been rigged was documented with evidence pulled from the Council's own internal communications, and every promise that had been made and broken was recorded with the exact words th. It had been spoken, and the exact date they had been forgotten. Every insult was there, and every dismissal, and every moment of contempt, and every laugh at humanity's expense, and it was all time-stamped and sourced and verified, and it was undeniable. At the bottom of the document, there was a single line, and it said this: "You taught us what the Accord truly values, and we learned." Alara looked at the chamber, and she did not smile, and she did not cry, and she did not show anger, and her face was perfectly calm and perfectly still, and she looked at Torvax directly, and she held his gaze for a long moment, and then she turned and she walked out of the chamber. She did not look back. By nightfall, the human embassy was empty, and the staff had departed on a ship that no sensor detected leaving, and the building was scrubbed clean, and there was nothing left inside, and not even dust remained on the surfaces, and it was as though humans had never been there at all. On Vareth Prime, the delegates sat in the chamber long after the session had ended, and they looked at the data crystal that still projected its damning record into the air, and nobody moved to turn it off, and nobody spoke. In the void between the spiral arms of the galaxy, far from any star or system or trade route, the human fleet held position in perfect darkness, and 10,000 ships hung motionless in the black, and they emitted nothing and they reflected nothing, and they were ghosts made of metal and purpose. Admiral Assant stood on the bridge of the Consequence, and he looked at the tactical display that showed him the positions of every ship in the fleet, and each one was a small point of light on his screen, and together they formed a constellation that only human eyes would ever see. His executive officer, Commander Chen, stood beside him, and she looked at the same display, and she said that the council would send someone to look for them eventually. Assant nodded, and he did not take his eyes from the display, and he said 2 words. "Let them." The stars outside the viewport were cold and distant, and they burned with ancient light that had traveled millions of years to reach this point, and among those stars, somewhere in the vast and indifferent dark, humanity waited, patient and invisible and ready. The galaxy had spent 42 years ignoring the humans, and now the humans had returned the favor, and the silence that resulted was the loudest thing the galaxy had ever heard. 6 months after the vanishing, the galaxy was breaking apart, and it was breaking in ways that nobody had predicted and nobody could stop. The economic damage had spread like a disease, moving from sector to sector and system to system, and every week brought new reports of shortages and failures and collapses. And the council held emergency sessions that accomplished nothing, because the problem was not political, and it was not military, and it was structural, and the structure had been quietly built by human hands over 4 decades, and now those hands were gone. On the Accord world of Thessara Prime, the hospitals ran out of a compound called vericillin, which was a broad-spectrum treatment that worked on 60 different species, and which had been synthesized by a human pharmaceutical company, operating under license from the council, and the company had vanished along with everything else, and the formula was proprietary and encrypted, and nobody could reproduce it, and patients began to die. On the trade hub of Kesari Station, the logistics network that managed cargo flow across 11 major shipping lanes, degraded to the point where ships were waiting in queues for days, and perishable goods rotted in their containers, and merchants, who had never given a second thought to the humans who designed the system, were now cursing their absence with every breath. The Rithani Collective published a report that calculated the total economic impact of humanity's departure, and the number was so large that the translation matrices could not render it in most species' numerical systems, and the report concluded with a single observation, which was that the Galactic Accord had systematically undervalued humanity's contributions by a factor of approximately 11,000. This report was not well received by the elder races. The political consequences were even worse than the economic ones, because the cracks that humanity's departure had revealed were not new, and they had always been there, and they had been growing for centuries, and humanity's vanishing had simply torn away the surface and exposed the rot beneath. The younger species, the ones who had joined the Accord in the last few thousand years, had always resented the elder races, and they had always known that the system was unfair, and that the permanent seats and the weighted votes and the provisional classifications were tools of control disguised as tradition. But they had accepted it because the system worked, and because challenging it seemed impossible, and because the elder races had always been too powerful to confront. Now the system was failing, and the elder races were scrambling, and the younger species smelled opportunity. The Cathari were the first to move, and they were a reptilian warrior species, with a culture built on honor and direct action, and they had watched humanity's humiliation for years with growing discomfort, because the Cathari understood what it meant to be dismissed by those who considered themselves superior. The Cathari ambassador stood in the council chamber and announced that his species was withdrawing from 3 Accord treaties immediately, and he cited the council's failure to maintain economic stability and its refusal to reform the membership system, and he spoke with a cold fury that made several nearby delegates physically retreat. The Somi Federation followed 2 weeks later, and the Somi were a small and peaceful species known for their expertise in agriculture, and they had never been aggressive or confrontational, but they had been provisional members for 19 years, and they were tired, and they demanded a vote to reform the classification system and to grant full membership to all provisional species immediately. Torvex blocked the vote. He used a procedural mechanism that only permanent members could invoke, and he killed the motion before it could reach the floor, and he did this with the same casual authority he had always wielded, and he did not seem to understand that the ground beneath him had shifted. Riots broke out on 2 Somi worlds, and for the first time in living memory, Accord peacekeeping forces were deployed against member species, and the images of Somi civilians being dispersed by Velthari security drones spread across every communication network in the galaxy, and they were devastating. The council was fracturing, and everyone could see it, and nobody could stop it. It was in this atmosphere of chaos and desperation that Torvax made his greatest mistake. He convinced the Velthari hegemony to assemble a war fleet and send it into the Orion Shelf to find humanity and bring them back to the negotiating table by force if necessary. And he argued that a show of strength was the only way to restore order, and that once the humans were reminded of their place, the rest of the younger species would fall back into line. The Velthari High Command agreed, and they assembled 4,000 warships, which was the largest fleet mobilization in 3 centuries. And the ships were massive and powerful, and they carried weapons that could crack planets, and they moved through slip-space corridors with the confidence of a species that had never lost a war. The fleet arrived at the edge of the Orion Shelf, and they found exactly what the scout ships had found months earlier, which was nothing, and the space was empty and dark, and the sensors showed no contacts and no emissions, and no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The fleet commander, whose name was Verk, and who had fought in 7 campaigns and never known defeat, ordered his ships to spread out and conduct a systematic search, and 4,000 warships fanned across the void like fingers reaching into darkness. They searched for 6 hours and they found nothing. And then the fracture drives activate. The first sign was a shimmer in the space between the Velthari ships, and it was a visual distortion like heat rising from hot ground, and it lasted less than a second, and then there were ships where there had been no ships, and they were everywhere. Human vessels materialized inside the Velthari formation, and they did not appear at the edges or from a distance, and they appeared in the gaps between ships, and beside ships, and above and below ships, and the Velthari sensor operators stared at their screens in disbelief, as thousands of contacts appeared simultaneously in positions that should have been impossible. The Ember network coordinated the entire fleet as a single organism, and every human ship knew exactly where every other human ship was, and exactly where every Velthari ship was, and the positioning was so precise that not a single vessel was at risk of collision. Every Velthari warship had at least 2 human ships within weapons range, and some had 5 or 6, and the human ships were smaller and sleeker, and their hulls were dark, and they did not look like any design the Velthari had ever seen. Fleet Commander Verk looked at his tactical display, and the display showed him the truth, and the truth was that his 4,000 ships were completely surrounded and completely outmatched, and that the weapons pointed at his fleet could destroy every single vessel before a single Velthari gun could charge. His hands trembled, and he had fought 7 campaigns and never known fear, and now he knew it. A communication channel opened, and a human face appeared on every screen in the Velthari fleet, and it was Admiral Kofi Asant, and his expression was calm and serious, and there was no triumph in his eyes and no gloating and no satisfaction. He spoke, and his words were translated into every language in the Velthari fleet, and he said that humanity could end the hegemony in 9 minutes, and that humanity was choosing not to, and he told them to take their ships home, and to tell the council that humanity's patience had not broken but had fragmented, and that every fragment had teeth. The channel closed. Verk sat in his command chair, and he stared at the blank screen, and around him his officers waited for orders, and the bridge was silent except for the hum of systems and the soft beeping of sensors that were still trying to understand what they were seeing. He gave the order to withdraw. 4,000 Velthari warships turned and retreated, and they moved through the human fleet like prey walking between predators, and not a single shot was fired, and not a single aggressive action was taken, and the humans simply watched them go. The journey home took 11 hours, and for every minute of those 11 hours, Verk knew that the human ships were still there behind him, invisible and undetectable, and that if they changed their minds, there was nothing he could do about it. The sensor logs from the encounter were classified at the highest level by Velthari High Command, but within 48 hours they were leaked, and the footage spread across every network in the galaxy, and every species in the Accord saw it. They saw 4,000 of the most powerful warships in the galaxy surrounded and helpless, and they saw ghost ships that appeared from nowhere, and they saw an entire war fleet paralyzed without a shot being fired, and they understood what it meant. It meant that the species they had laughed at and dismissed and humiliated for 42 years had been capable of destroying them all along, and had chosen not to. The message was not lost on anyone. And across the galaxy, on worlds belonging to dozens of different species, encrypted communications were sent to a single frequency that humanity had left open, and the messages came from the Kethari and the Somi and the Rithani and 30 other species, and they all said different things, but they all meant the same thing. Can we talk? In the darkness between the stars, Admiral Asant read the messages, and he passed them to Commander Chen, and she read them and she looked at him, and she said that it was beginning. Asant nodded, and he thought about Alara alone in that chamber surrounded by laughter, and he thought about the crystal she had left on the podium, and he thought about 19 billion people who had vanished into the dark and waited in silence for 6 months. It was time to come back into the light. But this time they would not come alone. The station hung in deep space, far from any star system, and far from Verath Prime, and humanity had chosen this location deliberately because the old council chamber carried the weight of centuries of corruption, and this new meeting deserved a place that belonged to no one. The station was called Threshold, and it had been built by human engineers in 3 weeks using construction methods that the galaxy had never seen, and it was elegant and functional, and it was lit by warm light that made every species comfortable regardless of their biology, and the air was filtered to accommodate 100 different atmospheric needs, and every detail had been considered with care. Alara Vasquez arrived first because this had been her idea and her burden and her purpose for longer than she wanted to remember, and she walked through the empty corridors of Threshold, and she checked every room and every system, and she made sure that everything was perfect. She wore the same formal suit she had worn in the council chamber on Verath Prime, and it was dark and simple, and it carried no medals or decorations, because humanity had decided long ago that this moment would not be about pride, and it would be about something harder and more important than pride. The delegations began to arrive over the next several hours, and they came in ships of every shape and size. And the Cathari arrived in angular warships that looked like they had been carved from volcanic rock, and the Somi arrived in graceful vessels that resembled seeds drifting on the wind, and the Rithani arrived in a geometric construct that hummed with mathematical precision. 34 species had answered the open frequency, and 34 species had come to threshold, and they called themselves the Ember Compact, because the name had been suggested by the Cathari ambassador, who said that an ember was a small thing that could either die in the dark or ignite a fire that changed everything. Alara stood at the entrance to the main assembly hall, and she greeted every delegation personally, and she shook hands and grasped claws and touched tendrils and exchanged chemical signatures, and she spoke to each one in their own language, using the translation matrix that human programmers had built, and that still worked flawlessly because they had designed it to last. Admiral Asant arrived last, and he came without warships, and he came in a single transport vessel, and he wore his dress uniform, and he stood beside Alara, and together they watched the hall fill with representatives of species that had been strangers a year ago and were now allies. The assembly began, and Alara walked to the podium, which was not elevated above the floor, because there would be no elevated podiums in this hall, and she looked out at the delegates, and she felt the enormity of the moment pressing against her chest. She spoke, and she said that humanity had not disappeared because it wanted to punish the galaxy, and that humanity had disappeared because it needed the galaxy to see something that could not be seen while humans were still in the room, and that something was the truth about what the Accord had become. She said that the Accord had been founded on principles of equality and mutual respect and cooperation, and that those principles had been hollowed out over centuries until they were nothing but words on a document that nobody read, and that the system had become a machine for concentrating power in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. She said that humanity had endured this for 42 years, and that during those years they had watched other species endure the same thing, and that the Cathari had been denied military sovereignty, and the Somi had been denied agricultural patents, and the Rithani had been denied research funding, and 100 other species had been denied 100 other things, and all of them had been told to be patient and to trust the system. She said that patience was a virtue, but that blind patience in the face of injustice was not patience at all, and it was surrender. And then she presented the framework for the new accord. It was a document that human diplomats and legal scholars and ethicists had been writing for 20 years, and it was comprehensive and detailed, and it addressed every failure of the old system with specific and enforceable solutions. The first principle was that no species would ever be classified as provisional, and every member would receive full rights and full protections from the first day of membership, because the idea that any civilization needed to prove its worthiness to participate in its own governance was an idea that belonged in the past. The second principle was that representation would be equal, and there would be no permanent seats and no weighted votes, and every species would have one voice, and that voice would carry the same weight as every other voice regardless of age or power or military strength. The third principle was that governance would be transparent, and every vote, and every motion, and every negotiation would be recorded and published and accessible to every citizen of every member world, because secrecy was the tool of those who could not justify their actions in the light. The fourth principle was mutual defense, and it meant that an attack on any member was an attack on all members, and that the strong would protect the weak not because it was convenient, but because it was right. And the fifth principle was a single non-negotiable rule that was written at the very top of the document in every language of every member species, and it said this: every voice matters, and no voice is provisional. The hall was silent when Alara finished speaking, and the silence lasted for a long time, and it was not the uncomfortable silence of the old council chamber, where silence meant that someone was being ignored, and instead it was the heavy and meaningful silence of beings who understood that they were witnessing the birth of something new. The Rithani were the first to respond, and their lead analyst 7 of Resonance stood and said that the collective had reviewed the framework, and that it was logically sound and ethically consistent, and that the Rithani would join the new accord immediately. The Cathari were next, and their ambassador stood, and he drew his ceremonial blade, and he laid it on the table, which in Cathari culture was the highest gesture of trust and commitment. And he said that his people had waited a long time for someone to say what Alara had said, and that the Cathari stood with humanity. One by one, the other species rose and declared their membership, and by the end of the session all 34 had signed, and the Ember Compact became the foundation of the new accord. The old council on Vareth Prime watched these events unfold with growing alarm, and the Velthari issued statements condemning the new accord as illegitimate and unauthorized, and they threatened sanctions and military action, and they used every tool of intimidation that had served them for centuries. But the tools no longer worked. Within a month of the signing, 60% of the species that had been vassals of the Velthari hegemony defected to the Ember Compact, and they left not because they were forced, but because they chose to, and because, for the first time in their history, they had somewhere better to go. The Velthari hegemony, which had stood for 4,000 years, began to collapse from within, and it collapsed not because humanity destroyed it, but because humanity showed the galaxy that it did not have to accept things the way they had always been. Torvax watched the defections from his office on Vareth Prime, and he stood by the window, and he looked out at the city that had been the center of galactic power for millennia. And he understood for the first time that the power had never been in the city, and it had never been in the buildings or the chamber or the podium, and it had been in the willingness of others to obey, and that willingness was gone. He thought about the human ambassador and her smile, and he finally understood what the smile had meant. On Threshold Station, Alara sat in the new assembly hall after the signing ceremony, and the hall was emptying as delegates returned to their ships, and she sat in one of the seats, and the seat was comfortable because it had been designed for a human body, and this small detail meant more to her than she could express. She thought about the day she had first walked into the council chamber on Vareth Prime 12 years ago, and she remembered how small she had felt, and how the seat had hurt her back, and how the delegates had looked through her as if she were transparent. She thought about the laughter that had followed her warning, and she thought about the years of quiet endurance, and the nights she had spent in her office staring at the photograph of Earth, and wondering if any of it would ever matter. She did not feel triumph, and she did not feel satisfaction, and she felt something quieter and more complicated, and it was the feeling of a wound that had finally been cleaned and bandaged, and that would heal in time but would always leave a scar. Admiral Asant found her there, and he sat beside her, and they did not speak for a while, and they just sat together in the quiet hall and listened to the hum of the station around them. Asant told her that he was decommissioning the Consequence and reassigning its crew to exploration vessels, and Alara asked him if he was sure, and he said that the Consequence had been built to fight a war that never happened, and that keeping it active would send the wrong message. He said that they had built those ships hoping they would never need to fire them, and that they had not fired them, and that this was the only victory that truly mattered. Alara nodded, and she understood. A young Cathari diplomat approached them, and he was newly assigned, and he was nervous, and he had clearly been working up the courage to speak to the human ambassador for some time, and he stood before Alara and Asant, and he asked his question. He asked how humanity had endured 42 years of humiliation without breaking. Alara looked at the young, and she considered the question, and she thought about it carefully because it deserved a careful answer. She said that they had not endured it, and that every slight and every injustice and every moment of contempt had been felt deeply and personally, and that humans were not made of stone, and that the laughter in the council chamber had hurt every time. She said that humanity had not endured the pain, but had chosen what to do with it, and that they had taken every wound and every insult and every broken promise, and they had used it as fuel to build something that could not be ignored. She said that, when humanity finally answered, it wanted the answer to be so complete that no one would ever need to ask again. The young Cathari stood very still, and he processed these words, and then he bowed in the manner of his people, which involved lowering his crest and exposing his throat, and this was a gesture of profound respect. He walked away and Alara watched him go, and she thought that he would make a fine diplomat someday. The station turned slowly in the void, and through its windows the stars burned with the same ancient light that they had always burned with, and nothing about the universe had changed, except that one small stubborn species from an unremarkable planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star had decided that enough was enough. The galaxy had spent 42 years underestimating humanity and treating them as provisional and temporary and unworthy, and humanity had spent those same 42 years building and learning and preparing and waiting. And when the moment came, humanity had not roared, and it had not raged, and it had not burned the galaxy down in fury. It had simply shown the galaxy what it truly was, and the galaxy had finally looked, and what it saw had changed everything. In the years that followed, the new accord grew, and more species joined, and the old council shrank, and the principles that Alara had spoken on that first day on Threshold Station became the foundation of a new era, and it was not perfect because nothing built by living beings is ever perfect, but it was better, and it was fairer, and it was real. And in the assembly hall on Threshold, every seat was the same height, and every voice carried the same weight, and no one was provisional. Not ever again. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and the lesson was this, and it was simple, and it was old, and it was the same lesson that humanity had learned on its own world long before it ever reached the stars. Do not mistake silence for weakness, and do not mistake patience for surrender, and do not mistake kindness for the absence of strength. Because the quiet ones are always the ones you should have been watching. And humanity had been quiet for a very long time.